Thank you, Howell. And with that, I'll just introduce our speaker for this morning, Adam Thomas. I've never actually met Adam before, so it was good to meet him and share a bit of fellowship over the breakfast table. He's the pastor of Litchard Mission. It is in Bridgend, isn't it? Yeah. I know you moved to Bridgend. I wasn't quite sure. And he's going to speak to us this morning on the subject of preaching through depression. So I'll hand over to Adam now.
Well, good morning. It's good to join you this morning. Thank you for the invitation. And I think I've met 4 of you before, but it's good to see the rest of you. It's good to see the people I've met before as well. It's good to join you today. And I was thinking how I should introduce myself. I've had a mini introduction. There are a few things I could use to introduce myself this morning. So I could say, I'm Adam, and I'm the wife of Hannah, and I have 2 children, Reuben and Abby. Or I could introduce myself by saying, I'm Adam, and I was the 2006 Devon and Cornwall Under-18 Indoor Archery Champion. Yes, I am that Adam Thomas. Or, and perhaps more seriously and more relevantly for today, I could introduce myself by saying that I'm Adam, and 6.5 years ago, in the darkness of depression, I made a plan to end my life. Maybe not words that you normally hear preachers say out loud from a pulpit like this, but that's one reason why I was very happy to speak on this topic today. It was a title that was suggested to me, this idea of preaching to and through depression, a really important topic for us to think about, for you to think about as preachers, and for us to think about as churches. An important area that we need to be better at talking about as Christians. Things have changed a lot in churches in recent decades, but we still need to be better at talking about these things, and that's relevant for us as preachers. Because, well, I'll give you 2 reasons why this is such an important topic. The first reason is that if when you're preaching in a church with people in it, which I'm guessing is most of the time, if there are people there, the likelihood is that there is at least one person in the congregation who has experienced or is experiencing depression. It's a very common mental health experience that people have. It may be that there are people who've been formally diagnosed with depression by a GP or whatever, or people who are experiencing something and may not really know what it is they're experiencing. They just know that things are not quite right. And as you're preaching, there may be people, it's quite likely there'll be people who are taking some kind of medication for depression. Sertraline, which is an antidepressant, is currently the 8th most prescribed medication in Wales. And the first time I spoke about my experience of depression, it was the 9th, so it's getting more common. And you may be preaching in a congregation where there are people who, like me, have planned or even gone further than I did and attempted to take their own lives. This is an important, serious topic. What are we going to say, and what are those people going to hear? And it's an important topic for another reason, which is the reason that preachers get depressed too. And I'm here today as living proof of that, that preachers get depressed too. I've got a book on my shelf that I haven't read, so I can't recommend it. It's called David Murray, called Christians Get Depressed Too. And that's an important reminder, isn't it? Because I think sometimes Christians can feel like depression shouldn't happen to us if we're Christians, as if somehow we're immune from the challenges of life in this world. We're not. Depression doesn't discriminate. And similarly, just because you're a pastor, a preacher, even if you've been preaching for decades, doesn't matter. Preachers get depressed too. And it may be that today this is a personal struggle for you, or it has been in the past, or will be in the future. None of us knows exactly what lies ahead, do we? And it could be that you may experience depression that comes out of a ministry experience, or it may be that it's triggered by something unrelated to ministry, but because we're humans, these things affect us. In my case, it was triggered largely by a very bad experience I had of abdominal surgery, and then it was exacerbated by returning to ministry. And it can be that you might experience depression for just a short period or for a longer period in kind of a crisis moment or in a more chronic sense. It may be that you get a formal diagnosis or don't, you may take medication or not, but preachers get depressed too. So that's why this is an important topic this morning and why I'm very pleased to speak about it. And there are lots of things I could say, and so it's possible I won't say the things you're hoping me to say, but there's a Q&A afterwards, so you can ask me questions. So make a note of questions as we're going through. But what I thought I'd do today is share with you 4 Bible verses that the Lord has used to encourage me through my experiences of depression, which is an ongoing struggle. I took my sertraline this morning, and that's how I have the ability to be here today. So 4 Bible verses that the Lord has encouraged me through my experiences of depression that I hope will encourage you and be a blessing to you this morning. A blessing to you firstly personally as preachers with whatever struggles or challenges you're facing, whether that's depression or another mental health challenge or just something else arising out of the weariness of life, whatever it is. I hope this will be a blessing for you today. But also that these things will help you as ministers of the gospel of grace in a world that is often very dark. That's what I'm hoping will be the result of this morning. So 4 Bible verses with 4 things that the Lord has taught me since my first diagnosis. And one of those verses, Hal read, but that's the last one we'll get to. So we're building up to that. And we're going to start somewhere else with a verse that the Lord has used to remind me of this really important truth. Depression doesn't make me a failure. That's really important. Depression doesn't make me a failure, either as a human or as a Christian. Turn with me to Psalm 103. This is one of my favourite psalms. If you're allowed to have favourite psalms, this is one of them. And there's lots in Psalm 103, isn't there? Precious words. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, and forget not all his benefits. And it goes on with that wonderful image of the greatness of his steadfast love. Verse 12, as far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. Wonderful words. But it's the next words that have really been precious to me and continue to be precious to me. Here are the words that continue to strike me from Psalm 103. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame, he remembers that we are dust. He knows our frame, he remembers that we are dust. Words that remind me that in my moments of weakness and frailty, God doesn't see me as a failure. He's not disappointed in me. He's not frustrated with me. He looks on me with compassion. As a father shows compassion to his children. Sometimes experiences of depression is such a broad category of so many different experiences, and it's always an unpleasant thing, and sometimes it can be really debilitating, affecting not just thoughts and emotions, but also energy, concentration, motivation, ability to make decisions, so many things. And as I go through my experiences of depression, as with I think any illness, I can feel like a failure, like I'm letting people down by not being better, not being able to do more things or to do them better, feeling disappointed and frustrated in myself. But Psalm 103 reminds me of how God sees me in those moments, with compassion. Why? Because he knows I'm only human. He knows our frame, we're formed from the dust. A hymn that we could have sung this morning, frail children of dust and feeble as frail, Psalm 103. That we are frail humans, limited, weak, living in a fallen world where we experience pain, sadness, darkness, sorrow, grief, where things go wrong in our bodies, in our minds, in our emotions, in our experiences, and where something that affects one part of us affects the whole of us because we are complex beings that God has made. But God knows all of our weaknesses and all of our limitations. He knows everything that affects us in life. He knows the things that are going to affect you in the next 7 days as well. And in those moments of weakness or frailty, Psalm 103 reminds us that no, we're not a failure, we're just human. We're just human. As preachers, we're always human. And God doesn't expect us to be anything other than human. Humans with finite energy, humans who sometimes get tired, sometimes get sick, sometimes have really hard days or hard weeks, sometimes get depressed. We have this treasure in jars of clay. And in his compassion, to quote a cliche, God says it's okay to not be okay because we're human. He knows that. And when we embrace that as preachers and remember that truth, then we can embrace our limitations rather than trying to ignore them, which is very easy to do in ministry, to try and ignore our limitations, because it's so easy in ministry to feel the pressure to keep doing more and more and more and more and more. And sometimes that can come from unhealthy ideas we have, sometimes the pressure of other people. Sometimes it's just what we know, Jesus is so amazing, or we want to make him known as best as we can, as often as we can. But we feel that pressure to be like superhumans who can just keep going and going and going and going and going. And some of you, I know, aren't pastors and will be juggling responsibilities in work, family, church, lots of different contexts where you feel that pressure to do more and more and more and more. And that pressure to push past our limits. But when we push past our limits, well, we'll just end up burning out or breaking down. I've been there. More than once I've ignored the warning signs and tried to keep going. It hasn't ended well. Now, ignoring our limits may help us to get to the next sermon, but it won't help us to endure in ministry for the longer term. I think of Paul's charge to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20, where he says these words: "Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock." Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock. And of course, Paul's main concern there is the spiritual health of the leaders and their alertness to the wolves that would come in and threaten the church. But as preachers, we're not just spiritual beings. We have bodies. And so we do also need to pay attention as preachers to our physical and mental well-being. That's part of how God has made us. We need to recognize our limits and our weaknesses and respond to them. And that will be different for each of us because we're all different. We're fearfully and wonderfully made, handmade by God. We've all had different experiences in life that have affected us. We need to pay careful attention to ourselves and to prayerfully respond to our weaknesses and limitations. Which does mean that today, after this, when I get home, I'm probably going to have a nap. Not just because of the amazing excitement of being here at the Itinerant Preachers Network that will wear me out, but also it's part of just how my depression affects my body and my mind. Like after this, I'll need a nap. And I used to feel like such a failure for needing a nap. And I'd be thinking, well, think what you could be doing instead of napping. And like other people can go to the Itinerant Preachers Network and not need a nap afterwards. Why do you need a nap? I'm not a failure, I'm just human. And God doesn't think I'm a failure. He knows my frame and he looks on me with compassion. And so we don't need to feel like failures when we need rest. We don't need to feel like failures if we need to say no to a preaching invitation. We don't need to feel like failures if we need to step back from responsibilities for a bit. We're not being failures, just being human. He knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. So that's the first verse, Psalm 103, verse 14. Depression doesn't make me a failure, doesn't make you a failure either, or whatever struggles we may have. Second verse, a verse I'll take you to that reminds me and reminds us of this really important truth. That Jesus knows how dark this world can be. Jesus really knows how dark this world can be. Now, I'm in a room of preachers, so you all know that it is now 89 days until Christmas. It's exciting, isn't it? You're ready? And every year at Christmas, I don't know if you have you probably have traditions that you have as a family. One of ours over the last 3 years is we get an Advent candle that has the names of Jesus on, and you can burn down through and get a different name of Jesus each day. The thing about this Advent candle, it's got lots of great names on, like Jesus and Redeemer and Emmanuel and the Rock and the Light. But there's one that's missing, which is one of my favourites. Man of Sorrows. What a name for the Son of God who came. Isaiah 53. In case you didn't know where Man of Sorrows is in the Bible, it's Isaiah 53. Another precious verse, Isaiah 53, verse 3, talking about the coming of Jesus into the world. Isaiah 53, verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. That when the eternal Son came into this world, the perfect Son of God, he didn't use his divine power to shield himself from the reality of life in this world. At the first Christmas, the Word really became flesh and really dwelt among us, and had first-hand experience of the darkness, the grief, the sorrow, the stress of life in this world. And this man of sorrows, the Bible says, is now in heaven exalted high, alive forever, as the eternal high priest who understands. He gets it. And he's with us in the darkness. He understands. He's been there. You know, as a preacher who continues to experience sometimes bad weeks with depression, weeks when everything just seems dark, everything is negative, my head's a mess, everything, even basic stuff is hard. In those weeks, I know that I have a high priest in heaven who understands and is with me in it. And by saying he understands, I'm not saying that Jesus would have been given a diagnosis of depression, but I do mean that Jesus knows what it's like to feel exhausted and drained by life in this world. He knows what it's like to be worn down by the relentless pressures of life. He knows what it's like to feel really alone. He knows what it's like to be tempted to give up. He knows what it's like to cry out, as he did in Gethsemane, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." It's quite a statement, isn't it? My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. A great comfort in our darkest moments. He's been there, and he's with us now. in Hebrews chapter 2. I say I'm giving you 4 verses, I'm giving you lots of other verses as well. Hebrews 2, another of my favourite verses that I repeat to myself a lot. In Hebrews 2, talking about the coming of Jesus into the world, and he shared our flesh and blood. He's tempted as we are, experienced the kind of stuff we experience. And it says that he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he's not ashamed to call them brothers. I like that. He's not ashamed to call us brothers. Even in the darkness of depression or whatever's afflicting us, he's not ashamed to call us brothers. He's not ashamed of me, he's not ashamed of you, because he understands. He gets it, and he's with us in it. And part of preaching in the context of depression, whether the depression we experience or the depression experienced by people that we are preaching among, the importance of remembering that full humanity of Jesus and what that means for us today. It's time for a Spurgeon quote. Spurgeon once said this, on a sermon on Isaiah 53, in fact. The afflicted do not so much look for comfort to Christ as he will come a second time in splendour of state, as to Christ as he came the first time, a weary man and full of woes. I'll read that again. The afflicted do not so much look for comfort to Christ as he'll come a second time in splendour of state, as to Christ as he came the first time, a weary man and full of woes. Do you get the point? That when we're in the midst of depression or some other darkness like that, the most comforting thing is not necessarily remembering some distant hope or hope that will seem very distant, but remembering the man of sorrows who is with me in the darkness now. I think back to some of my darkest moments, and I've sometimes explained it like this. And in those moments, I knew that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, to use another cliche. I knew there was a light at the end of the tunnel, but it felt like I was in a different tunnel. I couldn't see how that hope connected with where I was at the moment. What I needed to be reminded was that Jesus was with me in the tunnel, in the darkness, whatever the way ahead looked like. The eternal Son who himself faced darkness and was with me in it. And this is such an important part of Christ's ministry, to keep sharing as we preach for the comfort of those facing depression, but other struggles of life as well. That when we see the sufferings of Christ, that we don't just see the comfort of forgiven sin, although we do, and we rejoice in it, yes, but we don't just see the comfort of forgiven sin. We also see the comfort of a sympathetic high priest who is with us in the darkness and helps us in our struggles. And as we preach through the Gospels, we see that as part of Christ's ministry, to show people the full glory of what it means for him to be our high priest, not just offering that perfect sacrifice, but also walking with us as our perfect brother who understands life in this world. Jesus knows how dark this world can be, Isaiah 53, verse 3. Third verse. I'll take you to another verse now that reminds us of something very important. A verse that the Lord has used to remind me of this. I can be honest with God about my depression. In fact, I can be honest with God about anything. But seeing as we're here talking about depression, I can be honest with God about my depression. I'll take you to another psalm. I've come to appreciate the psalms a lot more since my depression diagnosis. That seeing these words that address the full range of human emotions and experiences and engagements with the world. And as you will know, lots of psalms are lament psalms, psalms that cry out from this broken, dark world, longing for things to be different, asking questions about why things are this way. And most of the psalms of lament They begin with lament, but they kind of transition to a note of hope, a note of confidence in God. Except one of them, the one I'm going to take you to, Psalm 88. Psalm 88, if you look at the last verse of this psalm, it's quite a psalm to read later. The last verse of Psalm 88. Here is how the psalm ends. You've caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness. Or if you've got the NIV, it says, darkness is my closest friend. Full stop. What a way to end a psalm. Not with, God is my closest friend, but darkness, my closest friend. It's not a verse that I've often seen on like motivational, inspirational posters that you put up in your house. But what a precious verse and what a precious psalm when you're experiencing the darkness of depression. To see that there are people of faith who in the past have experienced this anguish and this darkness and have really wrestled with it, and to see that I can actually express those feelings to God without needing to pretend, without needing to hide, without needing to put on a good face. And to see that when I'm honest with God, he listens. Psalm 88 doesn't end halfway through with God interrupting him saying, I don't want to hear about that, or you shouldn't be feeling that way. Come back to me when you're feeling happy. It doesn't end with that. God listens to the whole thing. And the words are so precious to God that he's preserved them for us to learn from. There's another psalm. So we're now up to like 8 of my favourite 4 verses, aren't we? Another psalm, Psalm 56, that talks about our tears. It's like being kept in a bottle, treasured and precious to God. These psalms of lament that teach us to be honest at the throne of grace. So important for us as preachers. So important for the people who are sat in front of us when we're preaching. Being able to be honest. Because we're so good at pretending as Christians, aren't we? We do it pretty much every Sunday. In so many conversations we have, we just pretend. We put on a good face and pretend everything is okay. And of course, you don't need to go into the full reality of your life situation in every conversation you have on a Sunday morning. But at the very least, we should be able to with God. We don't need to pretend with him. We shouldn't pretend with him. And he already knows what we're feeling. So we may as well talk to him about it. That in my struggles with depression, I can openly and honestly come to God, the God of the universe, and he will listen. I think as preachers, we do need to learn and teach this language of lament, which is not the kind of language that we are so familiar with in the West, not necessarily always comfortable with. It's sometimes the bits of the Psalms that we don't talk about. If you ask people for their favourite psalms, you normally get like Psalm 23, that kind of thing, which is a good psalm, but you don't so often hear about the Psalms of Lament. And even within the Psalms of Lament, sometimes it's just the happy verses. A few verses in the middle of Lamentations 3, but not the whole rest of it that is the lament. So we're not always very good at lament. And of course, not all of life is lament. And not all of the Psalms are lament. But the laments are there because there is an important place for lament. And sometimes as Christians, obviously, we don't know what to do with lament because we know that we should rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always. We feel like the good news of Jesus should fill us with joy, so why are you depressed? But the reality is, think about the tension of life in this world now. Saved by Jesus, but waiting for his return. waiting for things to be made new. The Christian life now will involve both joy and sorrow, sometimes together. Rejoicing and sorrow are not opposites in the Christian life. 2 Corinthians 6, Paul says, he's sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. At the same time. Sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. We can think about Romans chapter 8, which is a wonderful chapter, isn't it? A chapter filled with joy, so many joyous verses and verses of confidence, and yet also the chapter where we get a New Testament lament of the creation groaning, and we're groaning along with it because life now is not what we long for it to be and what it will one day be, so we do lament as we rejoice in God. That for the depressed Christian, rejoicing doesn't mean stop being depressed, pretend you're happy. Rejoicing means remembering who we are in Jesus and then bringing our pain to the God who loves us. Rejoicing in the God who cares about our sorrow. So as we minister to those with depression in the churches that we visit or are part of, what will it look like for us to teach that language of lament? It may shape the prayers that we pray through the service, and the things we pray for, what we choose to preach, and when we preach passages, whether we really engage with the honest emotion of them or whether we skip over those bits to get to the quotable verses. And yeah, we've recently at Litchard Mission, I say recently, the last 2 years, we've started regularly singing psalms. I think that would be a good practice for Welsh churches to recover more psalm singing, to engage with the full range of what spiritual life looks like as children of God. But that's another topic, so you can think about that later on. But we can be honest with God about our depression or whatever struggles we face in life. Psalm 88, here's the fourth verse and the fourth thing that the Lord has taught me. And this brings us to the passage that Hal read, which reminds us and reminds me that Jesus can use my depression for good. Jesus can use your depression or your struggles for good. 2 Corinthians 1. Paul says in verse 9, verse 8, talking about the affliction experienced in Asia. These are honest words, aren't they? We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. Real moment of darkness. But looking back, Apostle Paul can see that was a time of learning, a time of growth, a time when the Lord was at work, a time of learning to rely on God, to depend on God, the God who raises the dead, the God of life. And in that moment he experienced the comfort of the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction. And that comfort he received, well, that prepared him to be a better comforter of others. That in that moment when he was so utterly burdened that he despaired of life itself, well, that moment wasn't wasted in God's hands. But God used it, and used it to prepare Paul to be a better comforter of others, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. And we can trust the Lord to use our struggles as preachers in the same way. And I've seen that in my experiences with depression, of how the things that the Lord has taught me about his kindness, his grace, his faithfulness, about what it means to be one of his people, that now I can share with others as I preach. But also ways that he has shaped me as a person in ways that I might not even be aware of, and yet preparing me as a preacher of comfort for God's people. I remember when I was first diagnosed, I assumed that I would never be preaching again. Understandably, obviously there's points where I got even beyond that in my thinking, but for most of the time that I was off with depression the first time, I assumed I would never be preaching again, that was the end of my usefulness in that way. But now I can see that even those darkest moments in God's hands were not wasted. He's still at work, still using them for his glory. That's true for all of you as well. I don't know your situations, I don't know your stories, but I do know Jesus. I know that in his hands, even the darkest moments of your life are not wasted. And Jesus can use those to equip you to be better preachers, in the sense of being able to better minister the comfort of God to his people. And you may not have experienced the same darkness as the people in the congregations where you're preaching. You may not have any idea what you have a conversation with someone before the service and you realize that you just can't even imagine what it's like to be in their situation. But look again at the wording of verse 4 of 2 Corinthians 1. It says that God, this is verse 4, comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction. So whatever situation we're in, as we receive the Lord's comfort, that prepares us to comfort others in whatever situation they're in any situation. And there's still a special kind of comfort that comes, for example, the comfort that someone else who's experienced depression can share with me, yes. But still, if you have ever been comforted by the Lord, which I'm guessing you all have, then you are prepared to comfort those who are in any affliction. You look out at the congregation on a Sunday, a whole range of different afflictions there, but the Lord can use your experiences, the comfort you've received, for your blessing to them. And as preachers, of course, we have the privilege of demonstrating an example of 2 Corinthians 1 in practice, of encouraging other people that their darkest moments are not wasted because they haven't been in our lives. Thinking back to that time when I assumed that was the end of my preaching, wasn't going to preach again, one of the transforming moments that the Lord used was when I read some blog posts by a pastor called Steve Neal. He's up in Bethel Oldham. Some of you may come across his name, Steve Neal. Occasionally he's written for Evangelicals Now. But the important thing is that he is a pastor who's experienced depression. And he wrote in his blog about his experiences of depression. And as I read of how the Lord had worked in his life, well, then the Lord showed me that actually maybe he can do that in my life as well. To use those dark moments in his plans. But for you to think about as preachers, what are the stories and examples that you can share of how God has been at work in dark times in your life? Not just to comfort people, yes, but also to show people 2 Corinthians 1 in action. How the Lord has comforted you, so you can comfort others. So for the people listening, that they know that's true of them too, as they trust in our Lord Jesus. 4 verses, plus some others, that the Lord has used to bless me in my experience of depression, that I hope are a blessing to you as preachers and for those that you minister among. That remembering that depression doesn't make us failures, that Jesus knows how dark this world can be, that we can be honest with God about our depression, that Jesus can use our depression for good. And my prayer is that the Lord will bless you as you seek to point people to the God of all comfort and to our precious man of sorrows, now in heaven, exalted high. that's all I have to share.